What happens when a development team has to make a remix of their previous game but refuses to do so? You get a game that experiments way more with the atmosphere and the ideas of the series than ever before. That's how development on Majora's Mask started. Miyamoto wanted to create a version of Ocarina of Time for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, with redesigned dungeons. Aonuma, however, thought differently about it, and after some bartering, it was decided he could develop a new game, as long as his team could finish it in 1 year. What we got was an interesting game for sure, but does the different style and the unique mechanics make it a Zelda game worth noting? The story picks up right after Ocarina of Time. Link sets off on a journey to find a lost companion. During his trip, he encounters the mischievous Skullkid and his 2 fairies. After Skullkid steals Link's horse, the cream-clad fairy boy gives chase. When he finally catches up to the forest imp, Skullkid uses an ominous mask to turn Link into a Deku plant. While trying to cure himself of the curse, Link soon comes across the original owner of the mask. The mysterious man explains that the mask was stolen from him, and asks Link to retrieve it. The young hero only gets 3 days to do so, as the masked salesman leaves after that time. Coincidentally, it appears Skullkid used the dark powers of the mask to summon the moon and make it crash in the world in those exact 3 days. Now it's up to our hero to stop the disaster from happening within the time that's been given to him. Majora's Mask is generally considered a much darker Zelda thematically, which is certainly the case. The game's main theme seems to always involve death in some kind of way. The moon crashing into Termina and killing everyone. The mask containing spirits of the deceased souls who still have unfinished business. Or the side quests dealing with some sad and somber stuff. While the world keeps it bright and wacky designs, the themes going on in this world are anything but. Its dark themes yet bright setting make the world of Termina feel very surreal and unsettling. There isn't almost a soul in this land that seems truly happy. Even the player gets hit with this feeling of futileness. One of the game's mechanics is traveling back to the first day, but in doing so only a small amount of progress is kept. In other Zelda games, Link arrives at a new location and is presented with a dilemma that is usually solved by destroying an evil in a dungeon. This is also the case here, but since players can't possibly clear the game without going back a couple of times, all the problems Link fixes on his quest get undone. The grief-stricken Zora, who regains her singing voice after her stolen eggs are retrieved from the pirates, is basically for nothing when you inevitably have to turn back to the first day. The game effectively shows you the fruit of your labor, only to see that same fruit back in the same depressing state it was when time is rewind, which leaves the player with a hole where satisfaction should be. It leaves the player feeling bad, and that's certainly not a bad thing. Majora's Mask is a lot more cinematic too. In Ocarina of Time, cutscenes were usually a simple visual with a wall of text over it, explaining events, places, or characters. Here, however, characters interact in cutscenes, and there's a lot more use of cinematic angles. This can be seen immediately in the game's intro. While a more refined cinematic approach was done to make the story more engaging, Majora's Mask seemed to intentionally leave a lot more questions unanswered. The copious amount of fan theories further solidify this. Who is the masked salesman really? Why does everyone in Termina look the same as in Hyrule? Questions like these are left blank, and soon the player's mind will wander to the possible explanations. Majora's Mask does things a bit differently than other Zeldas, and its setting and theme are what make this game such a beloved one. It somehow manages to exude sadness that seeps through the screen and slowly seems to engulf the player. Majora's Mask has the same Zelda formula, but the way it approaches the formula is radically different from most games in the series. There is an overworld with hub-like areas, where a series of tasks must be completed before the player can enter the area's dungeon. The main gameplay gimmick of Majora's Mask is the ability to switch forms and gain powers through wearing different kinds of masks. The main masks in the game allow Link to change into several of the series' staple races with all their unique powers and abilities. Link's Goron form can deal more powerful blows and can roll into a ball to crash through rocks at high speed. And Link's Zora form, for instance, can maneuver underwater with ease and throw his fins as boomerangs. Some masks don't have such radical changes and are meant to solve or help with quests, like the Rabbit Hood, which makes Link run faster, or the Fairy Mask, which draws in fairies from farther distances. The switching of masks is quick, and the different playstyles the main masks offer are fun to use. The second big unique gameplay mechanic is the 3-day cycle timer. Link must save all of Termina within 3 days' time. Characters and events will change depending on the time of day and what day it is, which makes the game feel like it's really progressing in time. It certainly appears impressive for a game from its era. What's not as impressive is that when time gets rewind back to the first day, all progress made those days will be lost. Items obtained and dungeons completed stay, but all disposable items like nuts, arrows, and even rupees disappear, meaning the player will have to recollect those items if they want to use them. Rupees can be deposited in a bank, but other items are completely lost. This mechanic shouldn't be a problem if players slow down time on the start of the first day, but they will still need to remember to do so and not waste time finding out where to go and what to do. If the player isn't as well versed in these kind of games, the time limit might be a frustrating nuisance. For the most part, the game follows a steady and nice pace, with little to no hiccups. That's not counting the entire Pirate's Fortress or the Water Dungeon. The Pirate's Fortress is an absolute pain if the player goes into the dungeon with less than a few bottles. Players have to collect 6 eggs scattered all across the fortress, and eggs can only be carried in bottles. Unless you've done any side quests or obtained extra bottles, you will have to either hunt down extra bottles or be forced to go back and forth between the fortress and the observatory quite a few times to deposit the eggs from the bottles. It's incredibly tedious to say the least. The water dungeon is a confusing mess to get through, and once a player gets through the dungeon, they get greeted with an incredibly frustrating boss. Bosses are another weak part of the game. They work much like other bosses from the series, with an exploit the player has to take advantage of with their newly acquired items. The difference here is that in other games the rule of 3 applies, but in Majora's Mask, bosses take a ridiculous amount of hits, which is very unlike bosses in the series. It's almost as if the bosses should have a life bar, and it makes the battles harder and sloppier than they need to be. The boss in the Water Temple specifically being more frustration than fun. These complaints don't mean Majora's Mask is a bad game. On a gameplay level, Majora does some things worse, but also better. The amounts of side quests in the game far outstretches anything any other Zelda has tried, and are some of the highlights of not only the game, but the series in general. Quests in previous games usually revolve around an NPC wanting the player to collect a certain item and bringing that item back to the NPC for a reward. No side story or what could be considered traditional classic questing to speak of. Majora's Mask mixes things up with some great side stories, even if the quests usually involve you just talking to a few people. There is a myriad of things that the game does differently from any other Zelda game that makes it so interesting to play. There are flaws mainly with the timer, the fortress and the water temple, but these are some minor complaints in a game that changes things up enough to make it stand out from the rest of the series. Majora's Mask recycles a lot of assets from Ocarina of Time, but despite that, it manages to create its own style and personality. This makes Termina even weirder than it already is, with characters that look the same as the ones in Hyrule, but who don't know Link and act entirely different. It all adds to the surreal mood and the bizarre vibes the game gives off. The location players visit are a definite step up from Ocarina of Time's areas. While most of the assets are recycled from Ocarina of Time, what's being done with them is what makes the difference. New things like a realistic human face on Link's statue or screaming face on the mirror shield have this uncomfortable creepiness to them. And that's something almost every new asset in the game has. Environments are, on a visual design aspect, certainly a definite step up. Locations have a more distinct flair compared to most areas from previous games. Areas take a platform-like approach, which makes traversing them way more fun. Instead of the fairly generic mountains, forests, and town areas, players are treated to more visually distinct and unique locations. By far the most visually distinct element of the game is the moon. All over Termina where the open sky is visible, so is the ominous looming threat. Even in locations where there's no clear sky, the moon makes itself known to the player by causing earthquakes. The sound design here is also of much help, with grumbling sounds whenever the earth shakes, and the bell tolls that happen every 12 hours to make sure the player never forget the danger that creeps closer. Being able to see basically the villain at all times is a very effective way to give the adventure a sense of dread and urgency. Music is on par with the rest of the series. Tracks are memorable, with the Ancients theme and the Stone Tower Temple certainly being the highlights. Above all things, Majora's Mask absolutely nails the atmosphere. Everything is dark and ominous, but still with a certain uplifting mood Zelda is known for. At the end, Majora's Mask will leave you with some of the most memorable moments of the series. The first time you meet one of the giants is one of the most memorable moments not only in Zelda but in gaming. Majora's Mask is another great addition to the series. Maybe not because of its level design or dungeons, but certainly because of its atmosphere. Its darker and more disturbing tone makes it stand out from other Zelda games, and make it memorable in its own unique way. The story is well done and falls in line with other games in the series, but the narrative highlights of the game are the side quests, which all have their own story to tell. Because of this, side quests are more varied and engaging to do compared to most titles in the franchise. As far as gameplay goes, the mask makes the game very different from other titles in the series. The 3D cycle mechanic isn't a nuisance for the most part, if players slow down time and make sure they return to the first day in time. But there can be parts where the mechanic can be a burden, certainly for new players. Players having trouble with dungeons or bosses will feel the sting of the timer the most, and get frustrated by it. The game is shorter than most Zelda games, with only 4 main dungeons. The Water Temple and the Pirate Fortress are a drag to get through, and the boss of the Water Temple is just frustrating on every level. Bosses now take a lot more hits rather than the series' rule of 3, and it can be a hassle to fight them sometimes. While its gameplay is fun, it drops the ball in a few cases, but it's still the same Zelda people have come to know and love. As far as presentation goes, the game nails it. Areas' geometry are more platformer-like and makes exploring them more fun. The dark, surreal atmosphere really shines here, with things like the moon letting its presence known at all times, whether it be auditory or visually. It makes the threat really sink in. The visuals are the same as Ocarina of Time, and while it's nothing impressive, the game's art style manages to make these old models have their charm. The game's cinematic approach was a series first, and it fits the franchise well. Majora's Mask is a great experience, with a few flaws that hinder it only slightly. Alright, so that's my second video review done. The reason I picked Majora's Mask is because I already wrote the review of Majora's Mask. And I thought, why not make a video version of the review? It's right after Breath of the Wild, and I have all my Zelda reviews, which is only 2 at the moment. There'll be more coming, but not right now. The way I recorded this footage was off of an actual Nintendo 64 with an Elgato. I would love to know how I can record cleaner, crisper footage without resorting to an emulator or a virtual console version. So if there's any way for me to record off a Nintendo 64 but have crisper, smoother images, I'd love to know. So if you know something like that, please tell me. Overall, I'm kinda mixed on this review now. I remember when I wrote it, I was really happy with it. Right now, I'm kind of feeling mixed. There's a lot of awful sentences, a lot of repeating. It's a bit of an awkward review, and I tried to clean it up a bit, but yeah, it didn't work that well. Overall, I think the review still does its job well enough, but it could have been done way better. So give me some feedback. I always appreciate feedback. Just don't be like, I don't like this, or I like this. Either way, it doesn't help me. Just tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like, tell me how I can improve these reviews. I'll see you guys on the next review or another video if you want to. Bye.